Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the third day of the University of Minnesota Extension's Climate Resilient Pollinator Habitats Across Minnesota Landscapes webinar series. So today is the third session of this four-part series, if you've been joining us for the last 2 days. And today, Dan Shaw and Aaron Loeffler will be speaking on the key steps for successful residential pollinator plantings. So shout out to my amazing team, especially because of yesterday, I had technical difficulties. So I just always like to brag about them. So I'd like to recognize each and every one of them. So we have Katie Druwitz today, who is in Fillmore and Houston counties, extension educator. Quincy Sadowski, who's in Stearns, Benton, Morrison, and Sherburne counties. Emily Lindenfelser, who's in Wright, Meeker, and McLeod. We have Brenda Postels, an extension educator, and Karen Jokla, who is yesterday's speaker, is also joining us again today, as well as Angie, who will be speaking tomorrow, and as well as Elaine Evans. I'm sure many of you know her, but extension educator and researcher with native pollinators. So I think that's everyone. I hope that I recognized everyone because I am so lucky to have them. And also, before I forget, I should also introduce myself. My name is Tara Young, local extension educator in Hubbard County. So just like yesterday, I'd just like to briefly go over how to all engage with each other in Zoom. I think you guys are all pros at it, but just a little reminder. So please use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. I'll be asking the speakers questions from that section only. So for any comments or resources that you'd like to share, please use the chat feature. And because we have a lot of really engaged people on every day, sometimes the chat can maybe get a little distracting. So you can always just use the up arrow and then unselect show the chat preview. So then you can really focus on Aaron and Dan's presentation. So also, don't worry if you don't catch everything from today's session. I'll be sending out the recordings, the resources, the Q&A, and the chat files, so a bunch of goodies from all of the days in the resource email on Friday. It's a really valuable email, so make sure to look out in your inbox on Friday. Awesome. Well, now on to Dan and Aaron. Dan Shaw is the Senior Ecologist and Vegetation Specialist with the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, or Bowser, as we like to call it. His work focuses on conservation partnerships, stormwater practices, plant community restoration, climate mitigation and adaptation, pollinator habitat, and invasive species control. He has also taught design and ecological restoration classes at the University of Minnesota for the past 25 years and has authored or co-authored and illustrated several publications, which we'll be sharing with you in the email. Aaron Loeffler is an ecological science conservationist with Bowser and has over 20 years working for Minnesotans in local, state, and federal agencies. She is also a volunteer U of M Master Gardener in St. Louis County. Awesome. We are ready for you, Dan and Aaron.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. It's good to be with everybody. Good to see such a large audience out there. So today we'll be talking about key steps to successful residential pollinator planting. So we'll be talking a bit about some of the conservation challenges that we're facing. I know this is a topic that is being discussed in some of the other webinars, so we won't cover that in too much detail. We'll talk about our response and then really get into the details about how to establish pollinator habitat, primarily in residential landscapes, but we'll get into a few other types of landscapes and projects that we're currently working on. The Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources is a state agency. Our mission is to improve and protect Minnesota's water and soil resources. And there's a real emphasis on working in partnerships. So we work with a lot of different conservation partnerships and work with residents around the state. So we'll start off with challenges. We usually start off with the more depressing part of what's happening and then try to get into what people can do to improve the environment. With insect loss, one thing we're really paying attention to is that there's a variety of different impacts that are influencing insect populations. So pesticides and pollutants our one impact, loss of biodiversity and floral resources, pathogens, and then climate change, which is a focus of this series, is having impacts as well related to extreme weather. There's a lot of variation in spring temperatures and just temperatures throughout the year, which are impacting pollinators. So that's something that we're paying a lot of attention to. And then habitat loss is an area that we're focused a lot on with our programs, looking at ways to establish pollinator habitat across a wide range of landscapes. So for individual wildlife species, there's really a range of impacts that are happening. Some of them are climate related with extreme precipitation and temperatures. Our extent of impervious areas creates stress on these different species as well. Urban heat islands is related to that impervious surface, but then also invasive species, habitat loss, pesticides, pollutants, and water pollution are all factors with these species and their overall health. As far as our natural habitats in Minnesota, we have about 1% of the native prairie that existed in Minnesota remaining. We've lost about 50% of our wetlands, and we have about 50% of the natural shorelines that still remain. So these are all areas that we are focusing a lot of attention on right now, trying to restore more of these habitats. This is what it looks like in the Twin Cities area. These polygons show the remaining native plant communities around the Twin Cities. This is information from the County Biological Survey from the Department of Natural Resources. So you can see the extent of the area that has been converted to other uses. And so really it's a lot of scattered, what we call fragmented areas of habitat left within this region. And much of that area has been converted over to lawn. It includes many impervious surfaces and buildings and other uses as well. But we have a lot of lawn in the state. This is something that we're thinking more about with our programs, how we can convert some of these larger lawn areas over to habitat. These areas contribute to emissions and other impacts related to fertilizer use and chemicals that are used on these landscapes. So there's multiple potential impacts to pollinators and other wildlife from large extensive lawns. So it's an area that we're looking at more and more related to trying to do conversions. And I know this has been talked about a bit in some of the other workshops, but worldwide there are decreasing insect populations, estimated that around 40% of insect species are declining across the world. And those of us that are out in these natural habitats and have been looking at them for decades have been seeing this decline. Part of it is in the decline of the flowering plants within these habitats. We're just seeing less flowering plants, more invasive species moving into habitats, but then also less birds, less insects, less amphibians within many of these landscapes. We have around 500 species of native bees in Minnesota. So a real diversity of native bees in the state. We don't know a lot about many of these species because we just don't have a good way to study them in detail. We know more about bumblebee species in the state. There's several bumblebees that have declining populations. In the case of Minnesota's state bee, the Rusty Patched Bumblebee, populations have declined around 80% over 20 years. So it's a really rapid decline. And our concern is that rate of decline may be similar for many of our native bee species that we don't know a lot about. The map on this graphic shows the historic range of the Rusty Patched Bumblebee. It's really the red dots and the yellow X's that show the populations of where they're being spotted in the state. Elaine Evans, is definitely an expert on bumblebees, and she'll be talking more about that in her webinar. But it's a species that we're paying a lot of attention to because of that rapid decline. But that's a similar decline for monarch butterflies and other species. So, we're just concerned about that rapid rate of loss. And then bird species have been in decline as well. There's a study that's showing we have around 3 billion less birds in North America since 1970. So a really rapid loss of birds. And it's mainly because birds really rely on caterpillars and insects as a major part of their life cycle. They're feeding them to their young. So they really relying on insects being in our landscape. So it's another reason that we're so focused on insects with our work. We really see them as a foundation of our ecosystem. So we really need to support insect populations. So ultimately, we're at a critical time for protecting our biodiversity. And I think this is something that our conservation community as a whole really is seeing, that we really need to be acting now to help save this wide range of species that we value within Minnesota. So we'll get into our response and things that we're doing. With our agency, we have a Living Landscapes initiative, and the focus of this initiative is to use different conservation programs to help address biodiversity loss and support pollinators and other insects. And this really is looking across landscapes, trying to find opportunities in lots of different types of landscapes. This can include urban landscapes with our Lawns and Legumes program. Could be more agricultural landscapes with our cost share programs and easement programs. We have a habitat-friendly solar program and a habitat-friendly utility program, so we're looking for opportunities in those areas to create habitat. We're also looking a lot more at roadsides as an opportunity for habitat as well. And we also have a habitat enhancement program called HELP that's focused on conservation lands and natural areas, trying to do restoration work in those areas. So each of these programs is working to fill certain niches within the landscape to try to rebuild biodiversity and ecological health. As we get out into some of the ag areas of the state where we've lost a lot of wetland and prairie, there's partners that are working together within these areas. So this may include Nature Conservancy, NRCS, DNR, so a wide range of partners working on this. Having a battery issue here. Step away for 1 second.
This is not where I do a song and dance, just in case you're wondering.
We were expecting that, Erin.
I know, I didn't prepare for that. Dang it. Oh, he's back. Oh, good.
Okay, we're good. So within these agricultural areas, we're focusing with a lot of partners on restoring prairie and wetland habitats. And so this is where a lot of our easement work happens within this region. We have around 300,000 acres of conservation easements through these areas. And so we're trying to restore more prairie and wetland. The Minnesota Prairie Conservation Plan is a plan that's been influencing a lot of this work and directing a lot of the activity that's happening. Within urban areas, we talk about rebuilding a matrix of habitat. And here it can be a combination of pollinator plantings, but also many stormwater plantings that include native plants are playing a role in creating this matrix. This matrix is really helpful for a wide range of species. Some bee species don't go very far on a daily basis, particularly some of the small bees like sweat bees. So having a matrix of habitat where they have more areas to access is really helpful. So it's part of the reason we're really focused on getting a lot of plantings across different urban areas and trying to rebuild this matrix. As we look at a residential yard, there's a lot of opportunity for increasing the climate resilience within these areas. So this can include adding native plants, which have multiple benefits. One of the big benefits of native plants is their deep root systems. They sequester carbon, they help with the overall soil health. So they're providing a lot of benefits within these landscapes. But then we also promote rain gardens, swales, buffer plantings, different types of plantings to help slow water down. One of the impacts we're seeing with climate change is extreme weather and just a lot of water coming down at certain times. So these types of practices can really help increase that resiliency and prevent runoff from happening. Adding trees and shrubs have many benefits as well, sequester additional carbon, provide a lot of benefits for birds and other species. And then soil health practices, adding organic content into soils, just ensuring that soils aren't compacted. These are all benefits that can help with climate resiliency, making sure that water is getting captured within these landscapes. So we wanted to talk a bit about the Lawns and Legumes Program. So this is one of our key programs that we're working on related to pollinator habitat. The larger vision for this project is to build a movement through community conservation and equitable engagement, and really trying to get as many residents around the state involved in pollinator conservation as possible. And it's been great to see the response with this program. It's been a very popular program. We've had around 40,000 applications now to do projects in the state, and just a lot of do-it-yourself projects that are happening in different areas. So it's been great to see that happening in Minnesota. It's really become a national model for establishing pollinator habitat. With this program, right from the beginning, we had three main components that we used for developing the program. One was an education and outreach campaign to try to reach as many residents as possible, really trying to support those do-it-yourself projects. This was a partnership with Blue Thumb, which is a collaboration of groups working to plant for clean water and local partners. We have individual landowner support grants. These are $400 grants that include coaching and workshops. And we do have an application that's opening in mid-February for these individual support grants, if anybody's interested in applying for this program. And then our pollinator pathways, those are competitive grants where local organizations apply to work with residents in different geographic areas, essentially to build corridors for pollinators. Particularly the Rusty Patched Bumblebee has been a focus to try to build corridors to help protect that species. We use a map to map the projects. Not all the projects are on here. It's not a requirement that everybody maps, but we'd like to get as many bees mapped here as we can with projects. There's yellow bees, which are the funded projects, and then blue bees, which are do-it-yourself projects. So we're encouraging people who are doing their own projects to map within this system. If you do a web search for Lawns and Legumes and Map My Project, you can map within that site, and we can send out yard signs if you're interested, if you've already done a project and want a yard sign through Lawns to Legumes. Next, we'll get into some habitat planting principles, and we'll start with some of the basics around how to think about a landscape and where to place habitat. And I think the important thing to note is that really any resident can make a big difference for pollinators. There's research showing that even small pollinator plantings are really having a big benefit, that the insects, the pollinators are finding those plantings, they're using them. Definitely the more plantings we have within an urban area, the more benefits we're providing. So that's why we're trying to get as many residents involved as possible through the whole state with creating habitat. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind for any resident, that you really can make a difference with your plantings. Even if it seems small, it is significant. Some of the main needs of pollinators include protection from pesticides, clean water sources, flower resources through the seasons, nesting sites. There's bees that nest in the ground. There's others that nest in stems. And then a network of habitat and protected refuge areas are some of the key needs of insects. And these are some of the guiding principles that we think about when we're talking about creating new habitat. Starting off with looking at your property, sometimes it's helpful to use Google Earth. It allows you to zoom in and you can measure polygons on Google Earth. You could just go into a map program as well and look at your site from an aerial. It won't have quite as much detail as Google Earth will. There's also some other sources with county GIS data and similar base maps that might be available to use as a starting point for planning out your landscape. But the main thing is you want to get an aerial where you can looking down on your property, where you can start thinking about where you might have different plantings within that landscape. And we find it useful to map it out a bit about where you have existing beds, existing planting beds, where you have trees. Also thinking about where the water is flowing through these landscapes, because there may be opportunities to intercept that water with some of the planting beds, or maybe a rain garden or shallow depression that you're creating throughout this landscape. Then the next step is to start identifying where your opportunities are for either adding to your existing plantings or adding new plantings within your landscape. And you're starting to build a vision of what you want to do within your landscape. One thing we try to do is use plantings to kind of frame some of the use areas. So it's helpful to think about areas that you use and areas that you want to keep as lawn or maybe a patio or other uses. And then also thinking about the trees and other plants that are in that landscape. And so this is an example of a planting. This is actually my house. So showing how we're using plants to frame the yard area that we do use within that landscape, and just adding more diversity into these different plantings. So that's one thing that we encourage, try to find ways to use the plantings to create essentially outdoor rooms with some of the lawn areas that you're keeping. With creating planting plans, there's different ways that can be done. They can be done with a computer program. There are a lot of computer programs that are set up for residents to use. And some of these that we have listed here are a little more complex, but if you do a web search, you can find a lot of different resources for web-based plans, but it's fine to do it on paper too and keep it relatively simple. So, if you don't want to invest in a software to do it, you can definitely do it by just hand drawing your planting. We have master gardeners involved in our Lawns and Legumes program as coaches, and coaches have been playing a really important role. So they're helping with some of this as well with the residents that are working with our program to help guide them with thinking about how to locate plantings within a landscape and then to do some of the layout as well. With our program with Lawns and Legumes, we are only reimbursing for native plants, and there's a few reasons for that. One is that native plants do provide a lot of environmental benefits, like their deep roots and helping with water infiltration, but the insects we're trying to benefit have evolved with these plants as well. So we feel that we can really benefit the widest range of insects by only using native plants within these landscapes. We recognize there are non-natives that provide benefits for pollinators and other insects, and it's fine to add these natives into some existing planting beds that have non-natives as well. We're always thinking about aesthetics, and sometimes it's helpful to have some hostas or other species in these plantings. But for our program, we're only reimbursing for native plants because of these benefits that they provide. Related to the deep roots, some of the roots of the prairie plants go down around 12 feet or deeper. And that's one of the big benefits. There's studies showing that as these roots develop, particularly in rain gardens, the infiltration rates actually increase. And so as over time as these projects develop, their benefits increase. When we look at the layout of plantings, there's some design considerations that we're thinking about. It's pretty common to use a combination of grasses, flowers, and shrubs within plantings to get different heights. The grasses play a role in supporting the flowers. It's pretty common to group species together. Sometimes that is adding additional aesthetics to a planting. That bottom right picture in this graphic is showing what we call a grass matrix. So that's a newer approach where we have a lot of grasses like maybe prairie dropseed or little bluestem, and then are planting the flowers in amongst those. We find that that matrix of grass can really help decrease the weed competition. Sometimes sedges are used for that type of approach as well. Usually we're planting shorter plants near the front, sometimes using some that are creating a border up in front for aesthetics as well. One thing we've learned over time, and we talk about this with some of the teaching I do, that the eye is really drawn to clean lines within landscapes. And so even if you have a messy planting, if there's clean lines within the landscape, they help create a sense of order. And that's been called cues for care. Joe Nassauer, that was a professor at University of Minnesota, developed that term. And it's really focused on trying to create elements in the landscape to create order. And just trying to look at these plantings in a way that we can have some order with edging. Maybe it's the border plants, and thinking about the layout of plants so that it's more acceptable to the public and more acceptable to neighbors. With preparing projects, there's definitely many ways that it can be done. And sometimes this can be overwhelming if you're new to establishing pollinator planting. Sod kickers are one way that sod can be removed, and that's what's shown in the upper right picture. It can be a bit of work. You're kind of kicking that along, cutting the sod out. These can quite often be rented from hardware stores or other places, but it can be a pretty efficient way to remove grass. It doesn't work as well if you have a lot of tree roots or a lot of rocks within the landscape. There are mechanical sod cutters as well that can be rented. And sometimes, like in my own landscape, I just use shovels and I just kind of scoop it out, or I use a mattock, which is kind of like a pickaxe, to kind of chop away at the grass and remove grass that way. So definitely many ways it can be done. We've been trying to decrease the amount of herbicide that's being used to convert pollinator plantings over from turf. So we're looking at different methods that can be used to do this. It's pretty common that we're using wood chips as part of the plantings that are being done through lawns to legumes, partly because it's, for new gardeners, it's a simpler way to suppress weeds, to hold moisture in the ground. As the plants get established, then less wood chips is really needed. And the ideal is to have a lot of plants together so that they're competing with the weeds and you really don't need wood chips moving ahead. What I tend to do in my own landscape is I do get wood chips, but I mainly use it in the front edge to keep the lawn from moving into my plantings. And that mulch on the front edge helps create a sense of order as well. Chip drop is a resource where companies that are out doing tree trimming, when they have a lot of wood chips, they can deliver wood chips to a residence. So that's something to check out, chip drop. But sometimes cities have free wood mulch as well. So there's different places that you can get wood mulch. We really promote local sources of wood chips versus bringing them from long distances across the country, and then also not using dyed wood chips within these pollinator plantings. Sheet mulching has also become common for pollinator plantings using recycled cardboard has been working out really well. Sometimes the cardboard is put down and wood chips are put on top just to camouflage over the cardboard. We usually leave that on. We might leave it on permanently and just plant into it. It can be removed at some point as well. And then there are newer types of products being developed, like wood fiber fabrics that can be laid out on a site, and then planting can be done within that fabric. I think this is my final slide before I turn it back over to Aaron here. One other thing that we think about with pollinator plantings is having habitat throughout the season. So winter, bees need a place to hibernate that might be in the ground. So sometimes bare soil within landscapes is actually a good thing because many of the bumblebees need bare ground areas to hibernate and go into the ground, like bare hillsides are sometimes beneficial for them. Spring blooming plants, that might be willows, but could be a wide range of other species. Summer blooming plants, fall, like asters and goldenrods.
Oh, it's so
And then active season, just water sources are beneficial to a lot of the insects as well. So thinking about the whole season is really helpful in trying to provide that habitat. I'll turn it over to you, Aaron.
Great. Well, thanks, Dan. Can you hear me okay? We're good?
Yes.
Yep.
Sweet. Okay, so I'm going to talk through some of residential pollinator habitat types. So we'll walk through some of them, and then we will walk through some resources that are available to anybody free of charge. Again, as Dan mentioned, part of this Lawns to Legumes program, or just establishing these native plants on all landscapes, is the do-it-yourself component. And so I want to highlight the resources available to everybody that could use, that want to do this, but I'm trying to, oh, next slide. Sorry, Dan, I forgot I have to do that. I'm trying to advance. Perfect. Okay, so this is a resource. Before I fire hose you with information, I did a little trial with these QR codes. So much of the information and resources that I'm going to be presenting in the next few slides, you should be able to take your handy smartphone and camera mode and be able to take a picture of that QR code, and it should download the resources that I'm going to be talking about. Primarily, Bowser, Xerxes, and Blue Thumb developed this amazing guide and principle and concepts for residential pollinator habitat. And so I'll be going through portions of that in the next few slides, but I do encourage you to download it and take some time with it because it's a really valuable resource. Next slide. So when we talk about residential pollinator habitats, we kind of break them into 5 different categories. So the first one I'll go into is the native pocket plantings. Then I'll touch briefly on the beneficial trees and or shrubs. Tomorrow, I think it's my understanding that Angie from the university extension is going to take a deep dive into that. So I won't go too far into detail with that. Third, we'll talk about pollinator lawn and turf alternatives, prairie meadows, and then our newest planting type would be the container planting. Next slide. So as far as native pocket plantings, those can really be sized, and they're on any kind of landscape. They're typically pretty small. They can be 10 by 10. I just established one and in my yard this last summer, and it was like a 4 by 9. And so I've noticed that regardless of what size or type of planting you do on your landscape, it's going to attract beneficial insects. And so I think, to Dan's point before, anybody can do this stuff. It doesn't require mass quantities of space, and I'll walk through some different types of plantings. Next one. So the rain garden's a really helpful planting. I will say that this one's a little bit more complex. They're typically installed in shallow depressions on the landscape. They really can help reduce the effects of climate change by capturing and infiltrating rainwater, while breaking down pollutants and providing habitat. So again, there's that QR code. You can, if you'd like to take a look at, our partners with Blue Thumb have developed this rain garden guide, which is a really great resource that walks you through the establishment. Again, because these actually have some hydrology involved in them, you may want to, it may be a little overwhelming, but so I would also maybe reach out to your soil and water conservation districts. Every county should have one. And many of those conservation districts or watershed management organizations or watershed districts, typically they would have someone that has some technical resources to be able to help provide one-on-one for the installation on these, because these are a little bit tricky. Again, these are going to be going in areas that have some saturated soil. Maybe you're mowing around them in your yard. They're kind of annoying little spots where you can plant species that will suck up that moisture for you. So those are a good alternative to a ponding water. Go ahead, Dan. Another type of pocket planting would be a boulevard garden, and you can see that on the top diagram that many of these boulevards actually collect sediment and bioaccumulate, and that can be troublesome if we have a rain event and say it's winter or it's getting cold out. You can see that the water will then go onto your sidewalk, and as it could be a danger to folks that are occupying or walking every day, can be tricky. So these are a really good alternative to establish plants that would that you would create a depression and then plant within those areas. You can see on the right-hand side that they're in that picture that's wild strawberry. That has been a good plant that provides pollinator benefits. They can kind of spread, so you just have to make sure that folks aren't tripping on your plants, but it's low growing, and so that's been a good tool. And again, the Blue Thumb has an amazing resource called Creating Resilient Landscapes that can walk you through many different scenarios on these. It gives you a really good explanation of how to install these. Next slide. Lakeshore plantings. These are another really multi-beneficial tool, and we use these a lot when we think about water quality because they do capture nutrients, they slow runoff, and they buffer wave action, which can decrease erosion on your shoreline, as well as provide pollinator habitat for many things, beneficial species or insects. And so these are a really great tool. Again, sometimes they can be kind of complex depending on the slope that you have on your landscape. Contacting, a landscape architect or your soil water district to understand, to really kind of determine the slope and what you need to do to be able to establish these plants would be helpful. Though the Department of Natural Resources does have a lot of tools and a program called Restore Your Shore that you can Google, and they have lots of resources there as well. Next. Again, Angie's going to dive into this tomorrow, but I just wanted to, I'm from northeastern part of the state, and so many of the first bloomers in spring are going to be our trees and our shrub species. So they're really important when we're considering developing pollinator habitat or just developing habitat on our residential landscapes, of incorporating some tree species. So don't forget about our tree friends, because those are really important spring pollinators. Next. And then another type of planting would be a pollinator meadow. So these are going to be larger planting, an alternative to turf, depending on, I look at it kind of from a cost in a way too, because these are bigger spaces. So depending on how much funding you want to establish this planting, you could use seed, and seed is a great source for these larger planting areas. Again, with seed, it's a little bit tricky because you don't have control of where the species are located. So much like Dan had kind of talked about design criteria and grouping like species together, that's really difficult when you have these larger areas with native seed. So you may want to just consider where you're going to be locating these meadows and what your neighbors may think, or your ordinance in your city. But they're a great garden alternative. Next one. So pollinator lawn and turf alternative is another option that you can do. Typically, they're made of a fine fescue along with low-growing flowering plants that work together to provide a low-maintenance turf alternative. And these can be really great as we start thinking about climate change because they typically are a low-mow type of planting. They improve infiltration and percolation, and they also provide really good habitat for some of our pollinating species, and they can be really pretty when you see the purple and potentially white different blooming plants out there, low growing. Next. And then the container gardens. These are a fun one. Specifically, if you are maybe in a situation where you don't own your land and you don't have control over converting certain areas into these type of gardens where you can garden in a container. And those can be small containers, those can be huge, big containers on wheels if you are in an impervious area in a apartment complex where you want to move those around, or a school or church. That's a really great alternative to create this habitat. And I think, this picture down at the bottom there, it's from Google, I think, sorry. But I think that's New York City. And I really loved the thought of having these balcony planters because I have planters on my deck that I replant every year. And I was just thinking how great it would be not to have to do that and also be attracting native pollinators at eye level, nonetheless. Next slide. So I'm going to go through a few resources. Of course, books. I love books. These are just a handful of the different books that have information about native plants. I will have to give a huge shout out to Heather Holm. That book she wrote and the photography that she takes pictures of these insects and plant relationships is just beautiful. So the pollinators of native plants is virtually it's literally on my desk at all times because as we all are learning about plant insect relationships, it's a really comprehensive book and it's been very valuable. So kudos to Heather Holmes in creating that book. Next slide. Other resources. So sometimes we're doing conservation not in our backyard, and we travel outside of our comfort zone and are curious about our plant species that we're looking at. So iNaturalist, these are different apps that you can download that I'm sure many of you on this call have used just to understand, to learn new species and to build a sense of community among people who are using these apps. I think that's been really fun to see what my neighbors are finding. And then as I travel to southern Minnesota and Prairie region where I'm not familiar, it's just really to hone your eye in and really train yourself and get to know the plants a little bit better if you don't have the capacity to bring all the books out in the field with you. Next slide. So this is a tool that I wanted to just spend a minute on. This is a really great tool. It's on the Blue Thumb website. You can scan the QR code there. And it really gives you the opportunity to find the plant that you want for your garden. So perhaps you're a more advanced gardener and you're really looking at your native planting or your garden saying, hey, I really need something that is not yellow or gold in fall. And that's tricky. But, this is a great tool where you can put your plant type that you want, the different height, maybe you're in the shade, what type of soil, and it'll come up with a list of species that would be recommended for your site, which I think is a really, really cool tool that's been hidden on the Blue Thumb website. So I really encourage you to take a peek at that. It has also a map of your ecoregion. So keeping that in mind, wherever you are in Minnesota or outside, you also are in a different ecoregion. So it's helpful to see where you are in the state. And then I think next slide, Dan. Also on that tab is a list of native plant nurseries and retailers. And so that'll give you to try to figure out where, if there is a native plant retailer in your area. I did want to point out too that, especially if you're in a rural part of Minnesota, there is an opportunity to click on this online ordering. And so that'll give you a list of all of the of many of the nurseries in Minnesota that will actually mail you these plants right to your doorstep. So that's been really, really helpful, like I said, for folks that maybe not in an urban area. And it's a great tool to help you locate those and support those native plant nurseries. Next slide. On the website as well, we talked about the 5 different types of plantings. There are also templates. So if you are, I mean, I'm a master gardener, which means that I'm learning every day. And so these templates can be a really helpful tool for beginner or advanced gardeners. And there's all sorts of different ones that are on this website. Dan, next slide. This is an example of just one of them. And so you can see that it talks about the blooming time, which Dan had mentioned, and how important that is to have those different species in bloom throughout the course of the year. It also depicts potential gardening design criteria. Next slide. And on the back, it's, if you were to walk into your native plant nursery and say, well, this template says this, but perhaps, your native plant nursery doesn't have alum root. Well, it gives you some other alternatives for species substitution on the back of that. And then also some planting tips for new gardeners. So I encourage you to check out those templates. They're really well done, and we keep adding to them every couple years as we see needed. Next slide. And then finally, I just have to give a shout out to, well, Dan primarily, who developed this really helpful resource on our Bowser website. It's called the Pollinator and Biodiversity Toolkit, and it's got just a plethora. I mean, there's just so much. I think part of doing this work, and especially if you're new to gardening and new to this space, it's just finding the information, because there's so much of it all over the place. So this is a really great toolbox that you can just click through and find the resources that you need if you need that. So I think, Dan, is that my last? Yeah, that's my last slide. Thank you.
Yeah, I think so. So next I'll be talking about management for long-term success. We just have a couple of slides on this topic. This is an extremely important topic, but we try to keep it as simple as possible. With care of these plants, watering can be important. The last 2 summers we had drought, so that created a lot of challenges for gardeners trying to get projects established. Usually these plants need around 1 inch of water per week. That can vary a bit depending on the conditions and with the soils as well. If you have really sandy soils, it might be a little bit higher than that. If you have heavier soils, it could be less than that. So it does vary a bit, and that's with rainfall. So between rainfall and watering, these plants need about 1 inch. Sometimes it's helpful to put a coffee can out or a cat food container, something where you can look at how much water is falling on these plantings and try to keep track of that. As far as weeds, we really essentially promote trying to pull them as early as possible when they're little, because as they get bigger, they get harder to pull. That's true with woody plants that are moving into plantings where you don't want them to be growing. As they get bigger, they get harder and harder to remove because the root system will keep growing. So it's best to try to remove those early from plantings. Sometimes there's opportunities to move them into a different planting or give them to a neighbor or somebody. And then keeping plantings clear of debris would be another need, just keeping any plastics or other materials out of the plantings. And replacing mulch in plants is needed. We talked a bit about mulch and how we use mulch near the early stages of plantings, but we do add some mulch into plantings quite often on the edges or places where there just isn't enough plant competition to keep the weeds down. That might be every spring that you'd be adding some wood mulch into a planting. Trying to get out and maintaining plantings around 3 times a year is a good goal. We talk about Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day as potential goals for trying to get out and do some weeding. That helps distribute it through the season a bit. It's just good to be out and checking on the plantings. It's a good way to see what's happening with the native plants and the insects that are showing up, so it can be an enjoyable process as well. It's good exercise being out in the garden. So just trying to get out there often enough to keep on top of any weeds that are coming in. So the weeds, we're trying to promote pulling of the weeds when they're little, over using herbicides. So if you can catch them early, that's really beneficial. With these plantings, we promote dividing plants. I'm trying to see what that plant is in the picture. I thought it was a wild geranium. I'm not sure if it is, but wild geranium is one that divides really well. And if you have a clump of wild geranium, you might be able to separate it out into about 8 or so plants just by separating out the roots. And that's true with most of our native plants. Most of them can be separated. Usually we do that in early spring or late fall when the plants are very dormant. If you are doing that in the fall, you need to water the plants in well before winter. And that's true with any planting in the fall as well. We do have lawns of legumes participants that are planting in the fall, and we tell them just keep watering the plants into the fall until the ground freezes, because you don't want the roots to totally dry out because it's really hard on the plants. So that's true with the transplanting, trying to make sure that you're getting them sufficiently watered. You can do some transplanting in the summer months, but usually you need to cut the plants back a bit so that they're not losing so much moisture from their leaves. They really get stressed when the temperatures are warm, and that's why we really promote that in the spring and the fall. Checking for any erosion problems is another thing we stress, looking for any trouble spots within gardens. Sometimes that's more of an issue within a rain garden where you have flowing water and you might have some erosion happening. And then in the spring, cutting back plants after average temperatures are around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So that tends to be around Mother's Day. And the reason for that is there are many native bees that nest in hollow stems. So we don't want to be cutting back that vegetation too early. There's some good guides out there on maintenance for pollinators and how different strategies for leaving stems standing. So for taking action, we have a couple of websites here for the Lawns to Legumes program. There's both a Bowser website that is for the larger program and the different components that we're running with Lawns to Legumes. There's also the Blue Thumb website. Blue Thumb is our key partner on the individual support part of Lawns to Legumes. So they have many of the resources for recipients of those grants on their website. They're the organization that works with Lawns to Legumes residents and helping them through the process and the reimbursements at the end. So they're playing a really key role with us, and they have a web page that has a lot of resources that are designed to help residents through the planting process. We're also encouraging Bumblebee Watch and iNaturalist for recording sightings of insects on planting. That's one thing we're trying to understand better, is how many insects are showing up on all these plantings that we're installing. What's the bigger impact that we're having with these projects? We really want to understand that better. And then there's the social media listed here as well as another way to stay connected with some of this work. So I think that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dan and Aaron. You obviously wonderful presenters, but also you really helped us understand how even the smallest of spaces can be really transformed into pollinator habitat. And I really appreciate your hands-on experience in establishing and maintaining. That's key. Ooh, looks like I lost my video. Into really creating a long-term pollinator habitat. So really great job. Thank you both. Clearly a lot of experience between the two of you. And it looks like we have a ton of questions. So just a reminder, all of these resources that Dan and Aaron shared today, as well as any in the chat or the Q&A, will all be sent out in the resource email on Friday. So don't worry about missing any of those because I'm sure you'll all want to be using them later. I don't know why my camera keeps going off. So, regardless, let's jump into the questions. So, maybe a good overarching one to start off with. Is there a planning entity that tracks these restoration efforts? If we're planning to do something, do you always want to know about it regardless of any funding that you need? Or they're just wondering if you want to be aware of all these projects happening?
Well, I think for our prairie plant or any pollinator planting that's being done, we are interested in having them mapped on our map, the one that had all the bees on it. So if you do a web search for lawns and legumes map my project, you can get to that page. It is really helpful for us to understand what is happening around the state. Whether you were very involved in the Lawns and Legumes program or not, it's just helpful to see where these projects are happening. And we really do want to understand the do-it-yourself projects. We know where the ones are that we funded. Those are mostly being mapped on the map, but we also want the do-it-yourself projects to understand where those are located. And we can send out a map, or I'm sorry, a sign as well if you're interested. There's a box to check on that page if you're interested in having a sign mailed to you for a lawns to legume sign. And we find those signs are useful just for communicating to neighbors and the general public about plantings and what the intent of that planting is. So there's some definite benefits of having those signs within landscapes.
Fantastic. And it looks like there's a lot of homeowner associations that have really strict rules on vegetation heights and other similar restrictions on just overall vegetation in properties. Are there any laws that protect homeowners and allow them to plant native plants or other vegetation without being fined or having any other legal action taken against them?
Yeah, I can take that question as well. So there is a state law that essentially says that cities need to allow the planting of pollinator habitat. It is still up to the cities to have individual ordinances. So the cities can have their own ordinances stating the size and the different dimensions of a planting that's happening. But that state law, I think, really sets a national precedent, really stating the importance of pollinator habitat and how cities should be thinking about including pollinator habitat within landscapes. So I think it is playing a really important role. The cities, they develop their own ordinances, and that's true with the townhome associations as well. They have their own rules, but it seems like there is a movement happening with townhome associations to start incorporating more habitat, partly because so many of their residents want to see habitat within those landscapes. So we're seeing that a lot. Sometimes it's in the community areas within those locations. Some of our partners are working with townhome associations. I know like Washington Conservation District is very involved in that right now. But then it may be smaller plantings that are part of an individual residence as part of a townhome association. So we're seeing a movement there. It's always been a tricky area to navigate for everybody, but we're seeing more opportunities within those landscapes.
Perfect. Are there any precautions as far as planting by a roadway? Are there any is there a decrease in the benefit when it comes to oncoming traffic as far as pollinator habitat? Do you have any opinions there?
I can jump in on this one too. I've been, watching the research on this, and there's been some recent research. Lauren Agnew was doing research looking at contaminants along roadways, and so a lot of it comes down to the speed of vehicles. So if it's a lower speed area, bees are pretty safe along boulevards in those areas. If it's a really heavy use highway, higher speeds. We may not want to be planting really close to the road, but planting further away is beneficial. So you're thinking about where to place some of that habitat, and there can be contaminant accumulation like heavy metals within some areas. So maybe by areas where there's traffic lights and there's a lot of vehicles that are stopped for longer periods of time, there could be more impact in those types of areas, more material coming off brakes and other parts of cars. So it really depends on the volume of traffic, but it is something we're thinking about where to place habitat in relation to roads. But for most city streets, it's not an issue. There's not enough traffic on those roads, and planting within the boulevards is safe for pollinators.
That's really nice to know that all of the time and effort spent into it, that it can be beneficial as well. And I'm freezing up a little bit on my computer, but I think what another question um, was Bowser going to do any research into using ecotypes of native plants that are a little bit more south of us to kind of mitigate those the climate shifting? Do you know if there's been any look?
Aaron, do you want to take that one, or you want me to? Me? Okay. Yeah, we're convening a big stakeholder group to talk about that topic, and so it's a controversial topic within the conservation community. Within urban areas, it seems there's more openness to moving plants further distances. Within natural areas, there's less interest, it seems like, of moving, particularly herbaceous plants like the grasses and flowers. But potentially going south and west because of our warming temperatures. So if we're looking for seed, that tends to be where we look first, is maybe south and west of sites because of the increasing warmth. And with our state guidelines, we have a 200-mile recommended range now of source distance for plants. It's widened a little bit from what it was, and that's mainly because of climate change considerations. So we are thinking about it a little bit differently than we have in the past, as far as how far is it appropriate to go to get seed and plants to plant in a certain area. But it's an ongoing discussion. There's a lot of debate about it. And trees and shrubs, I think there's maybe a little more acceptance just because it takes that much longer for trees and shrubs to develop and mature and flower. So we need to kind of be a little bit ahead of the game related to climate change there. And, it's maybe less essential with some of the faster establishing plants.
I guess I would just add too, I mean, that's where it's really valuable to work with your native, plant nursery. I mean, they are a wealth of information, those retailers, and they, specifically are located in areas that are collecting seed locally. And so I would suggest, if you have one, to tap into that resource as well. And I think that can be helpful. But way to answer that one, Dan. Good job.
Thank you. There's a lot of concern about wood mulches. Are there any recommendations, especially in terms of invasive species for jumping worms? Any things that you'd particularly point out, especially as far as coloring? There was a lot of concern about that mulching and sourcing mulching. Do you have any particular recommendations for that?
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit. Aaron, you can add to this too. We're interested in local mulches. Things like cypress mulch are moving from states like Louisiana, and they're impacting wetlands. So we really want there to be local mulches used that are sustainably developed. The dyes in the mulch, it's likely not a good thing for pollinators. I don't think we know a lot about what the impacts might be related to dyes. So, we just discourage that with plantings. Jumping worms are a big concern for both organic material like compost that's being moved, or potentially wood chips too. It's a bigger concern in facilities where maybe it's not tracked very well, as far as like how they're storing materials and if there's contact to the ground. And so it's a very complex topic, and we're learning more and more about jumping worms and the potential risk. I mentioned chip drop, and part of the reason I think that's a good option for a lot of residents is that that's newly chipped material. So as these companies are going around pruning trees, they're chipping it right away. And so there's not an opportunity for jumping worms to get into that material. If it's sitting in a big pile somewhere at a city facility or someplace, there is an opportunity potentially for jumping worms to get into that material. So that's where that type of material, I think, is a good source. Anytime we can avoid, purchasing lots of bags of mulch, I think that's a good thing, because it's just a lot more plastic that we're purchasing and using. So ways that we can find sources of wood chips that we feel are safe and are local, that's what we're promoting.
Let's see here. I'm doing everything on my phone. So look, I'm trying to get a good
Kara, do you want me to take over reading questions for you? Would that be helpful?
good. Thank you, Katie.
Sure. Okay, so there was a question. You mentioned that bird populations are dropping due to food sources diminishing. Does this have an effect on bird eggs?
That's a good question. I don't know if I've seen research on that specifically. I would imagine if a bird is malnourished, that it's going to affect their eggs and the embryos that are produced. I don't think we've seen information on that. I'm not sure if anybody on the call here has more information on that. But I think, it's both that they need to feed their young, these insects, but they also need to be healthy during that period when they're reproducing and producing eggs and feeding their young. So the adults need to be healthy as well. And if they're just not finding enough insects, they're trying to feed their brood, they're very stressed at that time because they're just on the move constantly trying to find insects. So they're vulnerable as well. So I think there's potentially multiple stressors that are happening on those birds during that time period.
All right, so we have a couple of questions about natives. Figuring out if you're buying a native and not a cultivar, along with if you're doing natives in like potted plants. Is there a specific type of soil that you would want to utilize for that?
Those are good questions. With the Lawns and Legumes program, so some of the webinars that we do for that program, we have a section on purchasing native plants and avoiding cultivars and varieties of those plants. So a cultivar of a native plant will have an X in the name, and a variety usually has a fancy name for that plant. Those plants aren't always bad, but we're not reimbursing for them through the Lawns and Legumes program because sometimes they're being bred for certain foliage characteristics or flower characteristics that are at the expense of the pollen and the nectar of that plant. So that's why we just have a policy that we don't reimburse for those with the program. But it comes down to the name. If it just has a straight name and a scientific name, like Asclepias tuberosa for butterfly milkweed is the scientific name, then it's a good chance it's a straight native plant. It's part of the reason that we really recommend that people just mainly work with their native plant nurseries. They go to the web pages that direct you to a native plant nursery because they're going to only have native plants at those places. They're not going to have cultivars. So that's probably the simplest way to solve that is by going to vendors that only sell those types of plants. So it is a kind of a complex thing to figure out if you're new to this. It's like a whole new language. Related to the containers, I think it probably is beneficial to have a higher sand component in those planters than you would in a normal potting soil. The potting soils tend to have really high organic content, and most of the plants we're using in containers are prairie plants that commonly grow in sandy soils. So maybe having about a 50% sand to 50% potting soil might be beneficial within those plantings. It's going to help with the drainage to make sure water is draining through quickly enough. It's not going to hold too much water, where some of those prairie plants aren't going to like that excess water.
All right, thank you. When starting a project, would you consider a no-dig planting? Would letting a tarp kill the grass, then put dirt over the dead grass be more beneficial to soil health? There was also some concerns about natives that might be living in the ground when you put that tarp over there.
Yeah, those are all good considerations. They're all, it's part of the complexity of trying to figure out how to do some of these projects. I think an advantage of cardboard is that it is a bit porous, and there's going to be gaps in between it. So some water is going to get through. It's still going to suppress sunlight from getting to the grass underneath. So it's still going to suppress the grass. It's probably going to suppress it slower than a tarp or plastic would for killing off that grass underneath. Tarps and plastic can definitely be used. Plastic's been used for quite a while. Solarization is a technique that is promoted that heats up the ground a bit too and helps kill off the grass. But we really promote just using recycled plastic if you're going to do that, like getting it from a greenhouse that's recycling their plastic versus buying plastic to do that. And there probably is some microparticles that are being left in that landscape too. So it's part of the reason I like cardboard as a material to suppress weeds, and then you can just let it decompose. The only cardboard you wouldn't want to use would be cardboard that's been used for produce, because sometimes pesticides have been used or sprayed onto that produce in the boxes. So finding other types of boxes, would be our recommendation.
All right. So we have someone who says they're grateful that you insist on native diversity for receiving funding for the Lawns to Legumes. Is there any effort to broaden the ecotype to include nurseries that have collected seed from hundreds of miles south? And then along those same lines, we had someone who was interested in the Bowser's Pollinator Pathway program, but saw that it was closed in June. So wondering if that's going to reopen at some point.
Yeah, that will be reopening in mid-February. I don't know if we have the exact date yet, but we should be sending out a press release when that happens, and that'll be on our website as well. So look for something coming out around mid-February. It should be some things that are in the news as well about that opening. With the seed, we're interested in genetic diversity of plants as well. We're interested in plant diversity within landscapes, but also genetic diversity. So having seed collected from different areas and grown can be beneficial to local ecosystems. We talked a little bit earlier about how far we're interested in going for seed. It's sometimes conflicting research about whether plants can be impacted by bringing seed too far. There are certain plants where there is research showing that if you bring seed from a long distance, it can change the genetics in a negative way for a local population. So that's why we are interested in bringing seed in from different genetics, but trying to keep it within a certain geographic area, at least within around 200 miles.
And then I just wanted to follow up a little bit. As far as I think your question was about the Pollinator Pathways grant. So our Lawns to Legumes individual support grant, the $400 reimbursement should be online in mid-February, as Dan mentioned, and that anybody in the state can apply. And so if you've applied and haven't got funded, please continue to apply. But I think the question was in regards to the Pollinator Pathways, and that would be that competitive grant program that is for bigger dollar amounts for establishing corridors and residential areas. And that that has since closed. And that funding source was a one-time appropriation. So the future funding of that competitive grant program, Pollinator Pathways, it will reside on this legislative session. So more to come on the Pollinator Pathways program, but certainly if we do get funding for that program again, we will do the same as we do the individual support and send out news releases and try to get the word out there because it's a really fun program to manage.
Awesome, thank you. Is there work being done with golf courses as far as edge planting, tee box plantings, anything like that that you're aware of?
There are some models within Minnesota. Keller Golf Course, which is over by Lake Phelan, is a really good example of a golf course that's incorporated a lot of native plants. I think we may have funded part of that project, but that's I think probably the best example I can think of in the state of a golf course that has really adopted native plantings in the rough areas. And so that it seems to be a movement within golf courses to have more habitat. And we haven't been too involved in that. You know, I mentioned earlier that we're really trying to get habitat into as many types of landscapes as possible. So golf courses would be a great candidate for doing more native plantings in just because of the big land area. And there usually are in between areas on those golf courses where habitat could be really beneficial. You know, we have to be conscious of pesticide use near those areas and thinking about that, but I think it can still be a good area for habitat.
Awesome. When managing pocket prairies or other meadows in the spring, what are some guidelines on when to burn or mow to reduce the impact on insects and other wildlife? This person is specifically in the Northeast. Is there a certain temperature or soil temperature? And they use both mowing and fire to manage.
Yeah, for managing those larger areas, mowing can be done as an alternative to fire. Our prairies are adapted to fire as being a key disturbance within those landscapes to maintain the health of prairies. But in many urban areas, it's just really not very easy to burn. And particularly if you have residents nearby, and you don't want to burn too close to your house because smoke can discolor siding sometimes or could melt it as well. So you have to be careful about how close a planting is to a residence for burning. But burning can be a good method of management for these plantings. For our larger plantings, usually we're only trying to burn about half of them at a time because we want to leave refuge for insects that are living within that prairie ecosystem. Or if it's really big site, we might break it up into 4 parts and we rotate it, burning one section each year. And as far as like how often we would burn a site, it might be around every 3 years or so. And we have been, in some cases, alternating spring burns and fall burns just to break up the cycle, and so that we're not having an impact on certain plants or certain insects always at the same time of year. So there's more information available now than there used to be around burning and thinking about insects. It's getting a lot more consideration. I think the main thing, it really depends on the certain planting that you have and whether it's in a good location to burn, whether burning might set back some early spring blooming plants that might be a dominance of your planting. You may not want to do a spring burn. You might want to wait and do a fall burn if you have a lot of spring blooming plants in your landscape. So a lot of complexity, I guess, around burning and some of the considerations about timing and how to do that. But it can be really beneficial for the plants. It just rejuvenates the plants, helps some of the seed germination as well within these planted areas if there's seed that's just kind of waiting for its chance to germinate.
Perfect. Regarding boulevard rain gardens, is there funding resources available for specifically labor costs for these. And then in addition to that, is the $400 reimbursement available for nonprofit organizations or just private residents?
With the maintenance of rain gardens, like in a boulevard area, I think the first place to check would be with your watershed district to see if they have a cost share program that could potentially be part of a enhancement of a rain garden. So if you have an older rain garden that maybe isn't functioning very well and it needs to be rejuvenated, sometimes the watershed districts are good sources of funding to help with that type of work. Our state grants aren't really set up for that right now to help with that scale of work or that type of work related to rain gardens. Erin, do you want to take the other part?
What was it again? I got to.
So they're wondering if the $400 reimbursement is available for
Oh.
nonprofit organizations or just private residents.
It's primarily just residents. Yep. So if you're a resident of Minnesota, it would be on your at your address location. We do, you know, if we get the Pollinator Pathways funding again this next session, that is open to NGOs, nonprofit organizations, public and private nonprofit schools, and with soil and water districts and counties. And we've seen a really huge interest in that program. Just for example, I received $3.2 million worth of applicants, and I only had $1.1 million to fund. So there is a lot of NGOs, a lot of soil and water districts, neighborhood organizations that are really excited about doing this type of work. So, but like I had mentioned, that $400 reimbursement grant would be is specifically in the appropriation. It does identify residents.
All
I
right.
think before we do any more questions, I'm going to launch the poll if I have no other technical difficulties. And maybe I will. Emily, I think you can launch the poll on your end.
Okay.
It's just or I should be able to too. Oh, on my phone. There
There it
should be
is.
launched.
Perfect.
A lot
Yep,
of
so
technology.
the last couple of questions are pretty specific to individuals. Tara, do you want to answer those live or do you want to answer those in follow-up email?
And I mean, we can do that, or a lot of times I want to send them to their local extension offices. So
Sure.
I also send them that information. So if it is a very localized question, that's where we'd like you to get very specific
So
information.
this particular one is Ramsey County, which doesn't have a local educator. But wondering about the pocket plantings. I don't know, Dan or Aaron, if you know about those.
Well, the pocket plantings, like when we talk about pocket plantings, they're essentially a small native garden.
So, sorry to clarify, these ones are in Ramsey County and they're wondering like how to get in contact with the people that established them. I don't know if that's something that you guys are familiar with.
We've definitely funded a lot of pocket plantings through Lawns to Legumes, though we can't release the names of people because any of the residents participating in the program that's non-private data. So as an agency, we can't share that information.
Okay, perfect. And we did have someone wondering if you know yet if any of these programs are going to be affected by the current federal spending freeze. I don't know if that's information that you guys know at this time.
They shouldn't be affected by the federal freeze, other than we're always looking for additional funding sources for these types of programs. So we'd be looking for federal funding sources. But I think this will be, you know, a challenging legislative session for these types of programs as well. And I don't think this program is currently in a legislative bill.
Perfect. All right, Tara, I think that covers most of our questions here.
Perfect. Thank you again for jumping in.
No
This
problem.
is this is why I have an awesome team and also awesome colleagues that I can call on. So, thank you all for joining us today. This is the third day that we've done this. We have one more day in this series. So we really appreciate your participation with us throughout this whole week. And this really concludes our third to last session, our second to last session, I guess. And hopefully we'll all see you tomorrow for the fourth and final presentation, where we've been kind of alluding all week, where Angie Gupta will be discussing the giants of pollinator habitats, which are woodlands. So, I'll also be giving you all a sneak peek into summer pollinator programming that we are also planning across the state. So make sure to tune in and make sure to watch your emails on Friday. So see you all tomorrow. Be safe. We'll talk later. Thank you.